I grew up in Newnan, Georgia, the heart of Creek Country. This is what it looks like. Here's the schools, the homes, the town square. At the courthouse in the town square, there's a plaque, a historical marker commemorating the Treaty of Indian Springs. According to the marker, a chief named William McIntosh sold away his land to the whites and was murdered for it. I always wondered about this marker when I would walk past it. My knowledge of Native American history is admittedly limited in scope. I knew about the plight of the Plains Indians at the hands of American expansion, about Andrew Jackson's assholery and the Trail of Tears. But I never thought of a chief, a leader of a nation of Indians, signing away land like that. The desire to murder him made sense. What a jerk this McIntosh must have been, right? But then you read this letter. A letter written by McIntosh's wife, stained with his own blood.
When you see this letter, stained with the blood of my husband, the last drop of which is now spilt for the friendship he has shown for your people, I know you will remember your pledge to us in behalf of your nation. And when I tell you that at daylight on Saturday morning last, hundreds of the hostiles surrounded our house and instantly murdered General McIntosh by shooting near 100 balls into them, so that here I am, driven from the ashes of my smoking dwelling, left with nothing but my poor, naked, hungry children, who need some immediate aid from our white friends, and we lean upon you, while you lean on your government. And if you and your people do not assist us, God help us, we must die, either by the sword or the famine. I hope as soon as you read this, you will lay it before the governor and the president, that they may know our miserable condition. I followed them to their camp about 1.5 miles, to try to beg of them something to cover the dead with. But it was denied me.
Nobody came for him, not even the Georgians he supposedly trusted. Imagine my greater surprise when he looked like this. The idea of a culture broker suggests a man caught between two worlds, red and white, civil and savage. The struggle to balance the two. But how much does William fit this mold? How much of his life was spent not mediating between the Creeks and Georgians, but conquering one in favor of the other? Is he a culture broker or a culture destroyer? First things first, let's talk about Georgia. This is what it looks like in the 1800s. The lands of the Creek Nation are divided between the Upper Creeks in northern Alabama and the Lower Creeks in western Georgia. Newnan is here, I live here, and here is McIntosh Reserve, William McIntosh's plantation. But we'll get there later. Based on his biography, William McIntosh was born sometime around 1778. His Creek name translates to White Warrior. His father was Captain William McIntosh, who was a loyalist and served as an officer during the American Revolution. His mother's name was Sonoya. That name might sound familiar because, well, they named a town after her and have filmed a few things there, some of which you might recognize. Sonoya was a member of the Wind clan. It was pretty prominent in the Creek Nation, giving McIntosh a fair opportunity to rise to power. How he got his start early on, we don't know. The first time we see his name, he is selling beef to the Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins. This is what he looked like. Pretty mundane start, if you ask me, but it does set up a relationship between the two that would continue until Hawkins' death. McIntosh also benefited from having pretty prominent family members. I mean, you want to talk family trees, this guy came out of a damn redwood. Not counting Wind clan members from his mother's side, he also had his brother, William R. McIntosh, on the Georgia legislature. John McIntosh was a Treasury Department collector, and then there was Troop. No, not that one. This one. George M. Troop, U.S. Senator and Georgia Governor. They were cousins. The fact that he had so much family in high places meant both the U.S. government and Creek Nation wanted him on their side. For the Creeks, a half-white who could speak an average amount of English and read and write made him a valuable member of the council. The U.S. and Georgia government saw the same importance, and McIntosh was on his way to becoming what the Creeks hoped to be, an influential mediator. McIntosh played a number of roles during his life. He was tasked with spying on the Shawnee leader Tecumseh as he toured Creek Nation to rally warriors to his cause. Later, Hawkins relied on him to round up and execute the Upper Creeks accused of attacking white settlers. Once the Creek Civil War started up, McIntosh led his Lower Creeks with great success, leading the rescue of Big Warrior and fighting side by side with Andrew Jackson. Yes, I know Jackson ends up being kind of a prick, but let's put that aside for now. His success and his ability to speak English resulted in him being named Speaker of the Lower Creek Nation, making him the key representative when dealing with the National Council, as well as with whites. His rise to Speaker can be attributed to the power vacuum left behind in the Creek Nation. Both the upper and lower towns were led by aging headmen Big Warrior and Little Prince. Since age had rendered them both ineffective, McIntosh was in a wonderful position of power. All this means that by the early 1820s, McIntosh was a pretty popular guy, and arguably the most famous Creek to come out of the woodwork. His fame goes to show how he could flow so easily from one culture to another. At a public dinner in Augusta, McIntosh was the guest of honor, and was described by the press as prepossessing, dignified, entirely devoid of the wild, vacant, unmeaning stare of the savage. We have seen him in the bosom of the fosse, surrounded by a band of wild and ungovernable savages. We have seen him, too, in the drawing-room in the civilized walks of life, receiving that meed of appropriation which his services so justly merit. In each situation we found him the same, easy and unconstrained in his address, and uniform in his conduct. William McIntosh was the epitome of suave and savage. So far, so good for the culture broker model, right? We have a man of mixed heritage, with language skills, a high-ranking council position, and family members on both sides with leadership roles. He can easily fit in here and here. But, while he might look good on paper, McIntosh routinely showed his preference for one side. But Jacob, you ask, if he was in such a high position, why would he work against his own people? What evidence do you have that he was such a failure at being a culture broker? Well, I've done a little investigating of my own, so here's what I found. First thing, there was lots of money at stake. By the mid-1810s, the Creeks were no longer relying on the deerskin trade for income. Instead, they were dependent upon payments by the U.S. government, annuities for past land cession. The annual payment varied due to delays, but by 1821, they totaled out to around $150,000. I'm no economist, but that's a pretty penny in the 19th century. The civilization plan set forth by Thomas Jefferson was also in the process of turning the Creeks into yeoman farmers with plows, oxen, and manufactured cloth. This reliance on annuities and trade goods put McIntosh in a position to make a killing, and he did so with the help of David Bertie Mitchell. Mitchell was serving his third term as governor of Georgia when he was called to serve as an Indian agent, replacing the recently deceased Hawkins in 1816. Mitchell and McIntosh quickly went in cahoots with one another. Firstly, they ran the McIntosh-Mitchell store. Due to McIntosh's treaty negotiations, which we will get to later, his store was the only place to buy necessary goods. These goods, which were normally vastly overpriced, would be bought on credit. When the time came for the annuity to come in, McIntosh and Mitchell would take a certain amount out of the payment, which would be necessary to pay the debts of his customers. Now, technically this isn't illegal. Traditionally, the Creek Council would pay debts that were owed to traders, but this practice occurred at a time when the traders were whites, who could swindle the Indians and claim debts in order to get more land. Now, the trader in question was not only part Creek, but it is a high-ranking one at that. So, claiming the credit as a national debt, McIntosh took the money for himself. The next part of the scheme was even more impressive and much more fiendish. After paying off the debts, Mitchell would use the rest of the annuity to buy goods from the store, which he would then distribute to Creeks. Even with complaints coming from Creek headmen, who preferred cash, Mitchell ignored it. So to recap, McIntosh, who really should be helping both sides of the coin get along, is instead aligning with the Indian agent sent by Washington to take money meant for all Creeks to use. Another way the White Warrior undermined his own people was through his treaty negotiations. As the Speaker of the Lower Towns, he was the first one dealing with Georgia and the federal government when it came to land sales. He used this, like his store, for his own means. In 1818, during sale negotiations, McIntosh offered to cede more land to the federal government if the United States would exclude all white traders from the nation. This meant that the McIntosh-Mitchell store could exist without competition, putting more money in their pockets. The most notorious treaties McIntosh signed were the two treaties of Indian Springs. The first, signed in 1821, was negotiated at McIntosh's New Tavern. Lower Creeks dominated these talks with no upper town headmen attending. The deal eventually resulted in the Creeks selling the land between the Ocmulgee and Flint rivers in exchange for $250,000 and another $200,000 to be paid over 14 years. While an amount is uncertain, it is most likely true that McIntosh profited from this first treaty. As the Georgia commissioners wrote,
Our prospects of obtaining land from the Indians upon our first arrival were gloomy, but they now begin to brighten. General McIntosh is very unwell, but if his health should improve and the treaty be effected, he will pay you a visit in a few days for the purpose of obtaining money. We are in hopes the fine opportunity of obtaining a vast acquisition of territory so highly beneficial to our state and fellow citizens generally will not be neglected for the want of a little money, even if it should amount to $40,000.
This included 1,000 acres in Indian Springs and a square mile on the Ocmulgee River. The first treaty left McIntosh in hot water with the National Council, who considered having him killed for selling land to the United States. Only his fervent support of laws against land sales saved his skin. for a few years at least. In between, he had to ride a horse to death escaping Cherokee country after he tried to talk John Ross into selling Cherokee land on behalf of the U.S. government. Already in hot water, McIntosh's relationship with the Creeks boiled over in 1825 with the Second Treaty of Indian Springs. Though he publicly argued against any land cessions, McIntosh met in secret with Commissioners Campbell and Meriwether, trying to iron out a deal. However, he was outed, and the Creek Council dismissed him as Speaker. Outraged, McIntosh threatened to sell the land anyway, telling a friend to keep his gun ready. Fleeing to Coweta Town, he told the commissioners that he would only sign a cession at his own house to avoid being killed. He also sent a letter to President James Monroe requesting federal protection should he sell land away. In the letter, he claimed the failure to get the council to agree to previous land cessions was due to factionalism between Red Stick Creeks and supporters of the United States. He, along with other friendly Creeks, were the true representatives of the nation and were willing to sell, which he, along with a few other loyal Lower Town headmen, did on February 12, 1825. The Second Treaty of Indian Springs saw McIntosh selling all remaining Creek land in Georgia, along with 2/3 of land in Alabama, Upper Creek country. A provision was added to provide McIntosh protection, as well as payment of $200,000 to McIntosh, half the amount offered. Believing he had troops' protection, McIntosh remained in his home on the Chattahoochee. It was here, on April 31st, that he would die. Minowa, chief of an upper town whose land had been sold in the treaty, was appointed by the National Council to carry out the execution. 150 warriors surrounded his house and set it on fire. As McIntosh emerged from the burning house, he was shot over 100 times. Then they left, refusing to help bury the once great speaker. Speaking of which, let's go back to McIntosh Reserve. Few things stood out about this land. First of all, it's huge for one man to own, and shows how he had become more of an acculturated elite than a traditional Creek. His house stood here, a typical style home for the time. I can almost picture him looking out on his veranda or negotiating by lantern light with the commissioners. It's this sort of imagery that sort of pushes McIntosh closer to being the greedy white man, not the culture broker he should have been. So, what can we conclude about William McIntosh? Mine, personally, is that he's absolute garbage. He could have been a true culture broker, someone who could benefit both sides and use his natural skills to be a mediator. Instead, his greed became his downfall, and he used his position to his own advantage, manipulating both sides to get rich. In the end, he literally sold out his own people for profit. While I never condone murder, I can't blame the Creek Council for ordering his execution. They were gypped by the one man who should have been stopping such a thing from occurring. White Warrior was not so much a culture broker, but a culture breaker.